The world is reduced to a screaming, tearing, all-consuming roar. It is not a sound you hear with your ears. It is a physical force that punches through your chest, vibrates your teeth, and shakes the marrow in your bones. 16 rockets tear the fabric of the sky above a ragged Soviet birch grove, their searing white tails painting hellish stripes across the twilight. Below, the earth itself convulses. 4 BM-13 Katyusha launchers, massive and brutal on their American truck chassis, buck like wild beasts as they unleash their fury. The air ignites, thick with the smell of burning chemicals, scorched metal, and primal terror. This is not a battle. This is a natural disaster, summoned by human hands. 2 kilometers away, the German field headquarters ceases to exist. It is not destroyed. It is unmade. A storm of high explosives and jagged shrapnel turns trucks, tents, and men into a churning, fiery soup of debris. The sound of the impact reaches the battery seconds later, a deep, rolling thunder that is almost an afterthought. Senior Lieutenant Vera Sokolova stands not with the battery, but on a small, exposed observation knoll 100 meters away. Her ears are stuffed with wax and cotton, but the roar bypasses the ears entirely. She feels it in her stomach. In her notebook, her hand moves with a frantic, precise automatism, recording the fall of shot, the dispersion, the timing. Her face is a pale, immaculate mask of concentration, lit by the demonic backlight of the salvo. She is an accountant of the apocalypse. The last rocket screams away. The sudden, vacuum-like silence is more deafening than the fire. Ears ring in the void. The Katyushas, now just hulks of smoking steel, are instantly swarmed by their crews. Men move with the frantic, wordless efficiency of a drilled ritual, ripping smoking wiring, checking loading rails, securing the massive launch frames. A voice, raw and powerful, cuts through the ringing. Displace, loaders, speed is life, drivers, start your engines, 60 seconds, you mothers. That voice belongs to Captain Antonov. A bear of a man, his uniform perpetually smudged with oil and dirt, he moves through the chaos like a force of nature. He slaps a loader on the back, checks a truck's tire with a kick, his eyes everywhere. His battery is his family, his girls, the monstrous launchers he both loves and fears. He sees Vera on the knoll, and a brief, hard grin cracks his soot-stained face. His prot, G. The mathematician, the one who understands the soul of the machine. The first truck, its engine roaring to life, begins to reverse out of the firing position. The ritual is perfect. Fire and vanish. Be a ghost. It is at that exact second that a different sound slices through the post-salvo haze. A high, mosquito-like whine from the west. Everyone freezes for a fatal split second. They know that sound. A lone Focke-Wulf FW-189. Uhu, the dreaded frame, a German reconnaissance plane, emerges from a low cloud bank. It is not supposed to be here. The salvo was supposed to be swift, the escape immediate. A cruel twist of fate, a delay of 30 seconds in loading, has made them visible. Scatter! Antonov's bellow is pure instinct. The world dissolves into slow, horrific motion. The plane banks lazily, almost insolently. A single dark egg detaches from its belly. It does not scream. It whistles. A quiet, polite, utterly malignant sound. Vera's analytical mind, still humming with trajectory calculations, plots the bomb's path in real time. The numbers are flawless and horrifying. The target is not the launchers. It is the command truck. It is Captain Antonov, who is shoving his young signals operator, Yuri, into a ditch. Vera's mouth opens, but no sound emerges. The bomb connects. The explosion is a localized sun. The command truck, the heart of the battery, is lifted, folded, and torn into a million screaming fragments of metal and flesh. A wave of heat and concussive force hits Vera, throwing her backward onto the hard earth. Her notebook flies from her hands, pages scattering like terrified white birds. Silence again. But this is a different silence. Thick, woolen, poisoned with dust and the smell of burning gasoline and something sweet and metallic. Vera pushes herself up, her ears a tunnel of high-pitched whine. The world is muted. She sees the crater, still smoking. She sees pieces of the truck. She sees Yuri, the signals operator, stumbling from the ditch, his face a mask of shock and someone else's blood. And she sees Captain Antonov, or what is left of him. He is half buried in dirt and debris, his greatcoat shredded. One arm is gone. His face, miraculously intact, is turned toward the sky, his eyes still open, reflecting the fading fire in the west. The man who was a mountain is now just broken matter. Vera's body moves before her mind can engage. She stumbles down the knoll, her legs clumsy. The crews are frozen, paralyzed by the loss of their center of gravity. The giant senior sergeant Kruglov, Antonov's right hand, is on his knees by the crater, his powerful shoulders slumped, a low animal moan escaping his lips. Vera reaches the scene. Her training, cold and clinical, takes over. She checks for a pulse at Antonov's ruined neck. Nothing. The skin is still warm. Her fingers come away sticky. She looks at the blood on her hand, then at the stunned, lost faces of the men turning to her. The only officer left. The analytical part of her brain, the fortress, slams its gates shut. It cannot process this. Instead, it presents her with a single glaring equation: battery minus commander equals vulnerability. Vulnerability equals death. Her voice, when it comes, is not her own. It is flat, stripped of all inflection, cutting through the traumatic haze like a steel blade. Sergeant Kruglov, get up. Kruglov turns his massive, grief-stricken head. He looks at her, this pale, slight woman with blood on her hand and a hollow look in her eyes, as if she is a stranger, speaking an alien tongue. Get up, she repeats, the tone leaving no room for appeal. The aircraft will report our coordinates. Artillery will follow. We have 7 minutes, maybe less. She turns from the corpse of her mentor, her heart a block of ice in her chest. She addresses the battery, her gray eyes sweeping over each man, demanding their attention, pulling it from the abyss of grief. Loaders, finish the sequence. Drivers, to your cabins. Hook the launchers. We follow the secondary displacement plan. Route Gamma, now. For a second, nothing happens. They stare at Antonov, then at her. The disconnect is physical, a wall of disbelief and masculine tradition shattered by a bomb. Then, Private Markov, the youngest loader, sniffing back tears, moves. He turns and runs back to his launcher, shouting at his comrades. One movement begets another. The spell of paralysis breaks, replaced by the older, deeper spell of survival. Kruglov rises slowly, his eyes never leaving Vera. There is no respect in his gaze, only a deep, seething resentment and a shock so profound it borders on hatred. She is the symbol of everything that has been torn away, a ghost stepping into a giant's boots. Vera ignores him. She walks to where her notebook lies in the dirt. She picks it up, brushes off the soil from the pages filled with her neat, precise calculations. The numbers are still there. They are all she has left. She climbs into the passenger seat of the first truck, the one that will now lead. The engine coughs, roars. As the column lurches into motion, leaving the crater and their captain behind in the gathering dusk, Vera looks at the blood, now drying, on her fingers. She closes her hand into a tight, trembling fist, pressing the nails into her palm, until the pain is the only clean, clear feeling in the universe. The tremor in her fist is violent, uncontrollable. She forces it, by sheer will, to still. Out the window, she sees Kruglov, looking back at the fading scar in the earth, his face a monument of loss. Then he looks forward, at her truck, at the back of her head. The message in his eyes is a promise and a threat. The war is no longer a theoretical exercise. It has taken her teacher. Now it has handed her a broken family of grieving, hostile men and beasts of steel that scream. And it expects her to command them. The weight settles on her, colder and heavier than any winter. She stares straight ahead, into the darkening forest, where Route Gamma awaits. The mathematician is gone. Only the commander remains. For now. The forest swallowed them whole. It was not a retreat, but a frantic, blind burrowing into the damp, dark belly of the earth. The birch grove became a nightmare of contorted shadows under the high moon, the trucks lurching like wounded animals down a path that was not a path. Vera sat rigid in the passenger seat of the lead Studebaker, her hands clamped on the map and a dimmed flashlight. The paper was a living thing, trembling with the truck's violent shudders. Route Gamma, a theoretical line she had drawn based on aerial photographs and Antonov's old notes, was a fiction. Reality was a gully of sucking mud, hidden tree stumps, and branches that clawed at the canvas roofs like bony fingers. Her driver, the man they called grandfather, handled the massive wheel with a weary, practiced grace. He didn't look at her. His entire being was an extension of the machine, feeling the grip of the earth through the tires, listening to the engine's labored groans. The silence between them was a wall. Behind them, the battery was a chain of suffering. The roar of the engines was a dangerous beacon in the silent night. But stopping was a greater risk. Every crunch of a branch, every backfire, echoed like a gunshot in Vera's skull. Her mind was a hyper-alert radar, scanning not for enemy radio signals, but for the first distant whine of incoming artillery. The 7 minutes she had given them had stretched into 20. Every second was stolen, tense. A sharp, metallic crack rang out from behind, followed by a hissed curse and the squeal of brakes. Vera's heart seized. She turned the flashlight off, plunging them into near-total darkness, save for the slitted cat-eye headlights. "Halt!" she said, her voice raw. She was out of the truck before it fully stopped, the cool night air hitting her like a slap. She moved back along the column. The second launcher, truck number 2, was listing badly. In the gloom, she saw Private Markov on his knees in the mud, next to the rear dual tires. Senior Sergeant Kruglov stood over him, a hulking shadow of accusation. The axle housing, Kruglov's voice was a low growl, meant only for her as she approached. "A rock, a pothole. It's cracked. We're losing oil. This truck isn't going another kilometer." He didn't say, "I told you so." He didn't need to. His stance, the dismissive wave of his hand at the broken machine, screamed it. Your plan, your route, your failure. Vera knelt in the mud beside Markov. The young soldier flinched, as if expecting a blow. She ignored him, running her fingers over the jagged, damp crack in the cast metal. The engine oil was a black, slick ooze mixing with the earth. Her mind, the mathematician's mind, instantly presented the variables: weight of the loaded launcher, stress on the remaining axle, distance to the next possible hideout. The equation resolved to zero. Kruglov was right. But another part of her, the part forged in the fire of the crater an hour ago, rejected the zero. It presented not a calculation, but a memory. Antonov's voice during a late-night lesson. A battery is not machine, Sokolova. It is will. When the metal says no, you must find the yes in your men. She stood up, mud staining her knees. She looked past Kruglov, at the shadowy faces of the crew gathered around, exhausted, scared, waiting for her order to abandon their precious girl. "We are not leaving the launcher," she stated, the flat certainty in her voice cutting the night. Kruglov snorted. "Then we all die here when their artillery finds us." "We fix it," she said, turning the flashlight back on, not as a tool for herself, but to illuminate the broken axle for all of them. "There is no welding rig. No spare. This is frontline field repair, Senior Lieutenant." Kruglov spat her rank like an insult. "You cannot calculate a fix for this." Vera met his eyes, the beam of the light catching the furious, grief-stained defiance in his. She saw not a disobedient sergeant, but the embodiment of the problem, the human variable, the will that said no. She walked past him to the truck's storage locker. She wrenched it open. Inside were the tools, spare parts, the mundane guts of war. She found what she was looking for: a heavy-duty jack, thick steel cables, and a massive, forged steel tow hook. "We do not need to weld it," she said, her words coming faster now, a plan crystallizing under the pressure of his disdain. "We need to support it and redistribute the weight. We reinforce the broken axle with the cables binding it to the frame. We use the jack as a permanent brace. We disconnect the drive shaft. This truck becomes a trailer." She looked from Kruglov to the drivers, to the loaders. "Truck 4 will tow. We double hook it for stability. We lighten the load. Every shell, every personal kit from this vehicle gets distributed among the other 3. We move not as 4 launchers, but as 3.5. And we do it in 15 minutes. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't the silence of shock or grief. It was the silence of a difficult, tangible problem being absorbed by professional soldiers. Markov was the first to move. He scrambled to get the jack. A driver went for the cables. Kruglov didn't move. He was still the obstacle, the immovable object to her unstoppable, desperate force. Vera didn't command him again. Instead, she took the heavy tow hook herself. The steel was ice-cold and greasy. She dropped to her belly in the thick, freezing mud and slid under the massive truck next to the broken axle. The space was tight, reeking of oil and damp earth. Grit filled her mouth. She positioned the hook, aligning it with a solid point on the frame. She couldn't see Kruglov anymore, only the underbelly of the war machine, but she could feel the men watching. A woman, an officer, in the mud beneath a broken truck. It was either the final proof of her absurdity or something else entirely. From above, a shadow blocked the faint light. Large, calloused hands took the heavy hook from her. She looked up. It was Kruglov. His face was an unreadable stone mask in the shadows, but his hands were decisive. He braced his immense strength against the frame and, with a grunt of effort, seated the hook into place with a solid, final clank that resonated through the metal. He didn't offer her a hand. He simply slid back out. Vera crawled out after him, her uniform plastered with black mud, her face streaked with it. She stood, ignoring her appearance. She began barking orders, precise and technical, about cable tension points and weight distribution. This time the men moved with purpose. Kruglov worked alongside them, his voice now joining hers in coordinating the effort. 15 minutes later, the column was ready. Truck 2 was a cripple, lashed to Truck 4 with a spiderweb of steel, its wounded axle bound and braced. It was an ugly, desperate solution. A mathematician's nightmare, but a soldier's grudging masterpiece. As Vera climbed back into the lead truck, Grandfather glanced at her mud-caked form. For the first time, his ancient eyes held a flicker of something other than emptiness. Not respect. Not yet, but a faint, reluctant acknowledgement of a new, unfamiliar species of stubbornness. The engines roared back to life. The column began to move again, slower now, groaning under the extra burden. They were a wounded beast dragging its injured limb. But they were moving. The will had found its yes. Vera looked at the map, then at the dark, unforgiving forest ahead. The numbers were still there, but they were blurred now by the mud on her fingers. The first variable, the human will, had been forcibly entered into her equation. It was chaotic, irrational, and potent, and she had, for this moment, harnessed it. The cold, clean war of calculations was over. The dirty, brutal war of survival had her in its grip. Dawn was not an event, but a slow, gray infection seeping into the world. The forest thinned, giving way to a vast, sunken field of tall, wet grass that rippled like a silent gray-green sea. In its center, a darker island, a dense, neglected orchard of ancient, gnarled apple trees. This was grid square 7-4, their designated fire position. Not a fortress, but a perfect, gloomy shadow on the map. The final kilometer was crossed in absolute, nerve-shredding silence. Engines were killed 1,000 meters out. The 4 launchers and their crippled twin, now a single monstrous entity, were manhandled by exhausted crews through the sucking mud of a shallow creek bed and into the skeletal embrace of the orchard. Every grunt of effort, every scrape of metal against a branch, was a scream in the tense quiet. Men moved like ghosts in the pre-dawn gloom, draping the vehicles and themselves with netting and ragged strips of canvas, weaving them into the very fabric of the decaying landscape. Vera moved among them, a specter of mud and focused intensity. She did not command from a distance. She helped heave a branch, adjusted a net to better break the angular silhouette of a launch rail, her eyes constantly scanning not just their work, but the rising terrain to the west, the enemy's expected direction. Her mind was a cold calculator again, but now its inputs were visceral. The quality of the cover, the dampness of the earth that would muffle sound, the angles of escape through the orchard's labyrinth. With the battery hidden, a new, more torturous phase began. The weight. The men collapsed where they stood, behind wheels, under trucks, wrapped in their greatcoats against the creeping chill. Steam rose from their bodies in the cold air. Some slept instantly, a dead leaden slumber. Others, like Kruglov, sat with backs against a tree trunk, eyes open and staring at nothing, his face a landscape of exhaustion and simmering rage. Vera could not rest. The tremor was back in her hands, a fine, constant vibration born of adrenaline depletion and crushing responsibility. She found a spot near a moss-covered stone wall at the orchard's edge, a crumbling relic of a forgotten farm. From here, She had a narrow sight line to the valley below through a veil of bare branches. She unfolded her map, laid her compass on it, but did not truly see them. The theoretical had become terrifyingly real. In a few hours, she would give the order that would unleash those 16 volcanic mouths again. The equations would manifest as fire and shredded flesh 2 kilometers away. Antonov's face turned to the sky, flashed behind her eyes, not as a mentor now, but as a preview, a testament to the cost. A soft scuffing in the wet leaves made her start. It was grandfather. He moved with the silent, unhurried pace of a forest animal. He held 2 mess tins. Without a word, he placed one next to her on the stone. It contained a lukewarm, greasy gruel that smelled vaguely of cabbage and bacon. He settled himself a few feet away on the other side of the wall, becoming just another shadow, and began to eat his own portion with methodical slowness. The silence was not hostile. It was vast and oddly companionable. Vera picked up the tin, the warmth seeping into her cold fingers. She took a mouthful. It tasted of nothing and everything. After a long while, grandfather spoke, his voice a dry rustle, so low it seemed to come from the earth itself. He did not look at her. He stared out at the mist clinging to the distant tree line. He was scared of them, you know. Antonov. Vera froze, the spoon halfway to her mouth. Not of the Germans, of the girls. Grandfather took a slow bite, chewing thoughtfully. Said they were too hungry, that they ate distance and spit out fire, and that was a debt. Said a real gun, you can feel its limits. You can coax it. These, you just unleash them, and then you run. It's not a soldier's feeling, it's a different thing. He fell silent again, letting the words hang in the damp air. It was not comfort. It was context. He was explaining the soul of the weapon, the weight Antonov carried, the weight that now crushed her shoulders. The men, Vera heard herself say, the question she could not ask anyone else forming in the semi-anonymity of the dim light. They follow the order, but they do not follow me. Grandfather was quiet for so long she thought he hadn't heard. Then he grunted, a short, earthy sound. They followed him because he was a mountain. You could hide behind him. He finally turned his head, his old eyes glinting in the gloom, appraising her not as a woman or an officer, but as a phenomenon. You are a knife, sharp, necessary, uncomfortable to hold. They don't know yet if you will cut the enemy or their own hands. Before she could process this, a different sound sliced through the orchard. Not a forest sound. A mechanical rhythmic crunch. The deliberate, unhurried sound of boots on gravel. Many boots. Every molecule in Vera's body went rigid. She slowly, infinitely slowly, laid down the mess tin and pressed herself flat against the cold, damp earth behind the low wall. Grandfather had already melted into the roots of a tree, invisible. Through a crack between the stones, Vera saw them. A German patrol. Not the ragged infantry of the trenches, but clean, purposeful figures in field gray, moving with confident lethality. 6 men. They emerged from the mist at the far edge of the field, perhaps 200 meters away, following the line of the old creek bed. Their leader held a map. They were lost, or they were searching. Her heart was a frantic animal trying to beat its way out of her chest. Her breath froze in her lungs. 200 meters. A burst from their machine pistol, a flare in the air, and everything was over. The battery, hidden but not invisible, would be discovered. It would be a slaughter in this sunken bowl. She could feel, rather than see the terror radiating from the orchard behind her. The sleeping men were awake, frozen in their hiding places. She imagined Markov clamping a hand over his own mouth, Kruglov's finger curling white on a trigger. The German with the map pointed towards the orchard. He said something, his voice a casual, guttural murmur carried by the cold air. Two of his men unslung their rifles, beginning to move forward, not with urgency, but with routine caution. A decision crystallized in Vera's mind with diamond-hard clarity. It was not a calculation of odds. It was the cold, sharp logic of the knife grandfather had described. To fight was to die here and fail the mission. To remain silent was to risk discovery. There was only one path. She made a small, sharp gesture with her hand, a chopping motion towards the ground, hoping the lookouts hidden in the trees would see and understand. Do not move. Do not breathe. The two German scouts advanced to within 150 meters. They stopped, scanning the tangled branches of the orchard. One of them lifted binoculars. Vera pressed her face into the rotten leaves, her world reduced to the view through the stone crack. The officer's binoculars swept slowly, left to right. They passed over the mossy wall, over the shape that was grandfather, over the unnaturally angular shapes under the nets that her mind screamed were glaringly obvious. The scout paused. He lowered the binoculars, said something to his comrade with a shrug. The shapes were just trees, shadows, the debris of a dead place. For an eternal minute, they stood there. Then, the officer with the map barked a short command. He pointed away from the orchard, east, along the creek. The scouts shouldered their rifles, turned, and the patrol moved off, their crunching footsteps fading back into the mist from which they came. The silence they left behind was profound, ringing with the echo of averted catastrophe. Slowly, achingly, Vera unclenched her muscles. A tremor, violent and uncontrollable, racked her entire body now that the danger had passed. She rolled onto her back, staring up at the gray, uncaring sky through the black branches. Grandfather materialized from the roots. He looked down at her, at the physical manifestation of her fear and her steel control. He gave a single, slow, almost imperceptible nod. It was not praise. It was acknowledgement. The knife had been sheathed. It had not cut them. The lesson of the night was complete. It was not about ballistics or camouflage. It was about the nerve to hold perfect, petrified stillness, while death walked past close enough to hear it breathe. It was about the weight of a decision that left your own fate and the fate of dozens in the hands of an enemy's casual indifference. Vera lay in the mud, the ghost of the German binoculars still on her skin, and understood the command was no longer about mathematics. It was about blood, fear, and the terrible, lonely courage to do nothing. The world held its breath. The mist had burned away under a pale, impotent sun, revealing the valley in grim detail. The target was laid out below like a diorama of war. The railway junction, a raw scar of blackened earth and splintered wood from previous bombardments. Now, it teemed with a different kind of life. German engineering units swarmed over the debris like ants, their movements urgent and precise. A Panzer IV, its monolithic gray form idling on a flat car, was being coaxed down a makeshift ramp by a grumbling half-track. Lines of infantry, tiny stick figures from this distance, filed towards waiting Opel trucks. It was a node of enemy force, coiled and vulnerable. From her vantage point at the mossy wall, Vera watched through powerful, shielded binoculars. Her earlier terror was gone, burned away in the furnace of a single, all-consuming purpose. The trembling had receded, leaving behind a body of chilled marble and a mind of polished glass. She did not see men below. She saw coordinates. She saw vectors of force. She saw the intersection of rail lines as a mathematical point on her mental grid, labeled Ground Zero. Beside her, her signals operator, Yuri, a boy with a bandage still on his temple from the bomb that killed Antonov, held the field telephone receiver to his ear, his knuckles white. The line snaked back into the heart of the orchard, connecting her to the 4 launchers, their rockets now elevated to a precise, pre-calculated angle. The crippled launcher sat silent, a patient beast, its part in this dance over. The air in the orchard was electric, with a silence more deafening than any roar. 40 men hid in that grove, each one a coiled spring. Vera could feel their collective heartbeat as a physical pressure in her own chest. She could smell the sharp tang of sweat, the oil on metal, the damp, rotten apples. Time stretched, distorted. A fly buzzed lazily past her face, an obscene token of normalcy. The final confirmation from forward observation post crackled in Yuri's ear. He whispered the code word, his voice dry as dust. Zenith.
All parameters confirmed. Vera lowered the binoculars. She looked not at Yuri, but through the trees towards where she knew Kruglov stood by Launcher 1, where Markov waited by the firing mechanism, where Grandfather sat behind a wheel. She saw none of them. She saw only the culmination of the nightmare journey, the mud, the broken axle, the German patrol, the crushing weight of inheritance. She gave a single, sharp nod. Yuri spoke into the phone, his voice suddenly clear and strong, carrying the death sentence. "Battery, 1 salvo. Fire." For a fraction of a second, nothing happened. A universe of silence compressed into a single, agonizing point. Then the world ended. It began not with sound, but with light. A hellish, strobing orange flare erupted from the orchard depths, followed instantly by another and another as the first rockets tore themselves from the rails. The sound arrived a millisecond later. Not a single roar, but a ripping sequential cataclysm, a giant's roar shredded into 16 overlapping, shrieking convulsions of noise. The air itself seemed to tear. The ancient apple trees shook as if in a gale, shedding leaves and rotten fruit. The ground beneath Vera's feet liquefied into a shuddering jelly. She stood rigid at the wall, forced herself to watch. Through the binoculars, the view of the junction dissolved into a physics lesson of pure violence. The first rocket struck the flat car beside the Panzer. The effect was not an explosion, but an instantaneous disintegration. The flat car ceased to be a structure and became an expanding ball of shredded metal and wood splinters. The Panzer, 60 tons of steel, was lifted, rolled onto its side like a child's toy, a bright flower of flame blooming from its ruptured belly. Then the storm truly landed. The following rockets walked their devastation across the junction in a precise, apocalyptic pattern. The command post vanished in a geyser of dirt and shattered timber. A fuel truck swelled into a perfect, rising sun of black and orange fire, swallowing the infantrymen nearby. The neat lines of trucks buckled, twisted, and flew apart in a blizzard of glass and metal. But Vera's gaze, locked and unblinking, was drawn to the human scale of the cataclysm. The stick-figure men, through the magnifying lenses, became real. She saw one moment of organized chaos, the next, a silent, slow-motion ballet of annihilation. A man was lifted off his feet and thrown through the air like a rag doll. A group scattering in terror was enveloped by a dark cloud of earth and debris, and did not emerge. The orderly evacuation became a primal, panicked scramble into a landscape that offered no shelter, only different forms of death. The roar from the orchard ceased as abruptly as it had begun. The silence that rushed in was absolute, vacuum-sealed, ringing with a phantom tinnitus. In the valley, the sound of the impacts reached her, a series of deep, gut-punching thuds that were almost anticlimactic. The devastation was visual, a silent film of smoke, flame, and drifting dust. Back in the orchard, the ritual of survival began instantly. The crews, moving with the frenzied, wordless automation drilled into their bones, swarmed the smoking launchers. The still-hot rocket rails were cleared, cables disconnected, stabilizing jacks cranked with frantic speed. Engines coughed and roared to life, but Vera remained at the wall for 3 more seconds. She forced herself to absorb the entirety of the view. The column of black smoke already coiling into the sky. The tiny, burning figures. The utter, seamless ruin of the node. Her calculations had been perfect. Her first independent command was a flawless tactical success. A wave of nausea, cold and black, rose from the pit of her stomach. It was not regret. It was the horrifying, intimate understanding of her own power. She had not pressed a button. She had orchestrated this silent film horror from 2 kilometers away. The numbers had bled. The equations had screamed. "Captain!" It was Yuri, tugging at her sleeve, his face pale, eyes wide with the shared trauma of what they had just witnessed and wrought. "The displacement. We must go." The word captain broke the spell. She was not Vera the witness. She was Sokolova the commander. She turned from the wall, from the view of her handiwork. Her face was a mask of pale stone, but inside, a fundamental gear had sheared. Something had been burned away in that firestorm, something soft and human, replaced by a colder, denser alloy. She strode into the orchard, towards the waiting lead truck. Men avoided her eyes as she passed, not out of disrespect now, but out of a superstitious awe. They had pulled the trigger, but she had aimed. They felt the recoil, but she had conceived the shot. Kruglov was securing the last cable on Launcher 1. He looked up as she passed. Their eyes met. There was no resentment in his gaze now. There was something else, a grim, horrified recognition. He had seen the same view through his own binoculars. He understood the scale of the debt she had just called in. He gave a short, sharp nod. It was the salute of one executioner to another. Vera climbed into the truck. Grandfather had the engine running. Without a word, she pulled the crude, ink-stained map onto her lap. Her hands, for the first time since the night before, were perfectly steady. The column began to move, lurching out of the shattered orchard, leaving behind a carpet of scorched leaves and the ghost of their thunder. They were ghosts again, fleeing the scene of a perfect crime. But as the truck bounced onto a farm track, Vera did not look back at the rising pillar of smoke staining the sky. She looked ahead, into the blurring landscape. The victory was ash in her mouth. The commander had survived. Something else had died in the fire. The last of the mathematician's innocence was now just more fallout, settling over the silent, burning junction far behind them. They did not stop moving for 7 hours. The battery was a wounded, feverish organism fleeing the scent of its own kill. They drove through a labyrinth of secondary roads, through skeletal villages that stared with empty window sockets, across shallow, chattering fords that washed the mud from their tires, but not the soot from their souls. The adrenaline of the fire mission bled away, replaced by a grinding, hollow exhaustion that seeped into the marrow. Their destination was a patch of dense pine forest, a dark green bruise on the map far behind the shifting front lines. It was a temporary sanctuary, a place to breathe, to repair, to remember how to be men instead of just components of a firing mechanism. As the launchers were nudged into camouflaged positions under the fragrant, damp pines, a different kind of tension settled over the battery. The frantic energy of combat was gone, leaving space for the ghosts to walk. Men moved slowly, performing their tasks with mechanical detachment. No one spoke of the junction. No one needed to. The image was burned onto the back of every eyelid. The silent, expanding flowers of death, the toy-like vehicles flying apart, the stick figures erased. The roar of their girls was now permanently fused in their memory with that silent film of devastation. Vera claimed a small, relatively dry space beneath the roots of a fallen giant pine. It formed a crude dugout, a cave of earth and resin-scented wood. Here, with the battery hidden and the immediate threat of retaliation fading, the commander's mask finally slipped. The trembling returned, a full-body shudder she could no longer suppress. It was as if her nervous system, held in forced paralysis for a day and a night, was now screaming in delayed protest, She fumbled in her tunic pocket, her fingers numb and clumsy, and pulled out a small, water-stained notebook and a stub of pencil. Not her artillery log. A personal letter, begun weeks ago and never finished. Dear Tanya, the existing text read, "The spring here is cold. The birch buds are just—" The sentence stopped, severed by some past alarm. Her hand, still shaking, gripped the pencil. She needed to touch something human, something that existed outside the grid squares and firing solutions. She needed to tell her sister, who was welding tanks in a factory 1,000 kilometers to the east, that she was still alive. But the words would not come. The image that pushed itself onto the page of her mind was not of birch buds. It was of Antonov's hand, lying palm up in the dirt, the lifelines etched with grime. It was of the German scout lowering his binoculars with a shrug. It was of the Panzer, rolling like a child's toy. She pressed the pencil to the paper. It snapped in her grip, the broken point scoring a deep, ugly gouge across the page. She stared at the ruin of the letter, at the physical manifestation of her fractured connection to the world before. A low, soundless sob racked her frame. She brought her muddy, oil-stained hands to her face, not to weep, but to press against her eyes until colors exploded in the darkness, trying to erase the newsreel playing behind them. The sound of a Jeep engine, sharp and intrusive, cut through the forest murmur. Vera's head snapped up, her hands dropping instantly. The vulnerability was slammed back into its iron box. By the time the footsteps approached her dugout, her face was once again the pale, composed mask of Captain Sokolova, only the faintest redness around her eyes betraying the struggle. The visitor was a major from regimental staff. He was clean. His boots had a polish that seemed obscene in this place of mud and pine needles. His face was sharp, intelligent, and devoid of any trace of the hollow exhaustion that marked her men. He carried a leather map case like a badge of office. "Captain Sokolova," he said, his voice brisk, cutting through the silent disapproval of the forest. The work at the railway junction was noted, timely, effective. He didn't wait for acknowledgement. He unfolded a new map on the trunk of the fallen pine. It showed a different sector, a bulge in the line where a German mechanized battalion, reinforced and furious from the disruption of their supply node, was preparing a localized counterattack. The target was a Red Army Rifle Regiment holding a key village. The village was a hinge. If it broke, the line could buckle. "Your battery is now a strategic asset," the major stated, his finger stabbing a point on the map behind the German assembly area. "Their morale is high, aggressive. They expect a breakthrough. We will not blunt their spear. We will shatter their spine from within." He outlined the mission. It was not a single-fire mission. It was an illusion, a symphony of terror played by a single, desperate orchestra. The 5th Guards Mortar Battery was to perform a series of 3 rapid, successive strikes over the coming night. Each strike from a different, pre-designated firing position, each position several kilometers apart, along a wide, shallow arc. The goal was not maximal destruction, but maximal psychological disorientation. To make the enemy believe they were surrounded by not 1 but 3 or 4 Katyusha batteries, that their rear was collapsing, that a massive counter-barrage was tearing them apart from multiple directions. They were to be ghosts, phantoms of fire, sowing panic to break the enemy's will before their attack even began. "The ghost battery tactic," the major said, a hint of cold admiration in his voice. "Theoretically sound, extremely demanding. It requires flawless navigation, timing, and endurance. More importantly, it requires a commander with nerves of steel and a battery that can move like shadows." He finally looked directly at her, his gaze assessing, probing for doubt. "You have 12 hours to rest and prepare. The first move is at 2200 tonight." He left the new maps and coordinates. The Jeep's engine faded, leaving a silence now poisoned with a new, more profound dread. Vera studied the maps. The distances were punishing. The timing was tight to the point of impossibility. The margins for error were 0. It was a beautiful, brutal equation, and it was hers to solve. As she absorbed the scale of the task, a heavy presence manifested beside her. Kruglov. He had seen the staff officer arrive and depart. He looked at the new maps, his eyes bloodshot and weary, tracing the insane dance of arrows and positions. His face, already hardened by grief and war, seemed to age another decade in that moment. He understood immediately. The color drained from beneath his grime. He looked from the maps to the men scattered through the pines. Men trying to eat, to sleep, to stitch torn uniforms, their bodies still vibrating from the last mission and the frantic retreat. He finally spoke, his voice not a growl, but a low, horrified rasp, meant only for her. It was the sound of a man seeing a precipice. "Captain, look at them. The men are hollow. The trucks are on their last legs. That patched-up axle won't survive one of these moves, let alone 3. This isn't a mission. This is a death sentence for the battery. Worn-out men, worn-out machines, driving blind into the night to pretend to be an army. They'll find us. They'll tear us apart." He was not defying her. He was stating a material fact, a sergeant's accounting of his remaining capital. Exhaustion, mental fatigue, human limits. He was pleading with the commander to see the reality he saw. Vera lifted her gaze from the elegant, cruel lines on the map. She looked past Kruglov, at her battery. She saw Markov struggling to keep his eyes open over a mess tin. She saw Grandfather meticulously checking the patched axle on Launcher 2, his touch worryingly gentle. She saw the deep, communal fatigue that hung in the pine-scented air, like a poison. She saw all of it. The beautiful equation on one side, the broken human cost on the other. She met Kruglov's desperate, defiant eyes. The plea was clear: be human. Say no. Captain Vera Sokolova, her soul still scarred by the silent film of dying men she had authored hours before, her own nerves screaming for oblivion, let her gaze fall back to the map, to the coordinates, the vectors, the logic of the grand tactical game. The knife had to cut. There was no one else. Her voice, when it came, was quiet, flat, and carried the finality of a closing vault door. It held no triumph, no defiance, only the cold, absolute burden of command. "Prepare the battery, Senior Sergeant," she said. "We move at 2200. The night was not dark. It was a living, viscous entity of black ink and deeper shadows that swallowed sound and space. The world shrank to the faint, sickly glow of a single masked headlight on the lead truck, illuminating a ribbon of hell that passed for a road. This was not a road. It was a scar through a swamp, a tunnel through nightmares. The first displacement began with the silent, gut-churning strain of metal, pushed beyond its limits. The patched launcher, now designated the cripple, groaned and shrieked like a living thing as Grandfather coaxed it onto the makeshift trail. Every rock, every pothole, sent a jolt of pure agony through the frame, a vibration that traveled up through the seats and into the bones of the crew. Vera sat beside him, a map on her knees, but navigation by sight was impossible. She navigated by dead reckoning, by the feel of the truck's lurch, by counting the seconds in the darkness, by the faint, star-shaped silhouette of a blasted oak that was their first turn marker. Behind them, the other three launchers followed in a grim, blind convoy. No lights. Engines a low, choked grumble. Drivers leaned forward over wheels, eyelids propped open by sheer will, staring into nothingness, steering by instinct and the faint dust cloud of the truck ahead. Men clung to the sides of the vehicles, bodies tensed for the inevitable impact, the slide into a ditch, the snapping of an axle. Time lost meaning. An hour became an eternity of strained silence and deafening, mechanical protest. They reached Grid Point Alpha, a desolate open field near a bombed-out church. The silhouettes of the broken bell tower against the star-dusted sky were their only confirmation. The fire mission was a frantic, muted ballet. Launchers swung into position with brutal, hurried efficiency. No one spoke. Hands moved in the dark, connecting cables, raising rails to a preset angle based on Vera's hasty, flashlight-shielded calculations. The target was a German motor pool, 5 kilometers north. The fire command was a hissed whisper down the line. The salvo, when it came, was a localized, earth-ripping apocalypse that seemed even more monstrous for being unleashed from such total silence. The rockets tore into the night, their tails painting fleeting, blasphemous scars on the black canvas. The men didn't watch. They were already moving, unhooking, scrambling, their ears ringing anew in the sudden vacuum of sound. Before the last echoes of the distant explosions reached them, the battery was in motion again, fleeing the thunder they had birthed. The dance had begun. The second displacement was a descent into a colder, more intimate hell. The route took them through a forest flooded by spring melt. Icy black water, deeper than expected, surged over running boards, seeping into cabs, soaking boots and freezing feet into blocks of numb pain. The cripple's engine coughed, stalled. For 3 minutes that felt like hours. The entire battery was stuck, silent and helpless in the freezing water. While Kruglov and 2 drivers, chest deep in the icy flow, wrestled with the engine, their breaths coming in ragged, steaming gasps. Vera stood on the hood of her truck, a silhouette against the slightly less black sky, her entire being a listening post, straining for the sound of aircraft, of engines that were not theirs. The only sound was the gurgle of water, the frantic whispers of the men, and the hammering of her own heart. The engine fired, a sound of raw, mechanical triumph. They lurched forward. Gridpoint Beta was a shallow quarry. They fired again. This salvo was aimed at an artillery observation post. A shorter, sharper scream of rockets. A bloom of fire on a distant hillside. Move. Always move. The third displacement broke men. It was not the enemy that attacked, but exhaustion itself. A primal fatigue that seeped into the brain, turning thoughts to syrup, reactions to lead. Private Markov, on the running board of Launcher 3, simply let go. He slid off into the mud as the truck rounded a bend, too tired to even cry out. It was the driver behind who saw the pale shape fall and slammed his brakes, causing a concertina of hissed curses and near collisions. They found Markov curled in a ditch, asleep or unconscious, his body shutting down. He was dragged, limp and sodden, back onto the truck, tied to the frame with a belt so he wouldn't fall again. Vera no longer commanded from the front. She was everywhere, a ghost in the gloom. She appeared beside a driver to wipe condensation from a windshield with her sleeve. She put her shoulder to the back of the cripple when its wheels spun in sucking clay. She carried a canteen of metallic-tasting water to the men on the launchers, forcing it into their hands. She was no longer the knife. She was a current of relentless will, a spark jumping from one dying battery to the next, trying to reanimate them through sheer proximity. She looked into faces she passed. She saw eyes wide and unblinking with a fatigue so deep it resembled madness. She saw lips moving in silent prayers or curses. She saw Kruglov, his massive strength now a sagging, automated response, his resentment drowned in the universal swamp of utter depletion. They were not soldiers anymore. They were extensions of the machines, biological components fueled by fear, duty, and the fading echo of their captain's impossible resolve. They reached Gridpoint Gamma as a false dawn, a sickly gray smear polluted the eastern horizon. This was the final position, the grand finale of the illusion. The target was the heart of the enemy's assembly area itself. The men moved like sleepwalkers, their actions slow, dreamlike. They positioned the launchers among the skeletal remains of a burned-out farm. The cripple, its patched axle now weeping a fresh trickle of oil, was given a position of relative cover. It would fire, but it would not need to move again. This was its last stand, one way or another. As the crews prepared the final salvo, something had changed. The sullen, resistant silence was gone. In its place was a different quiet, a shared, profound understanding. They had crossed a frontier of endurance together. They had driven through water and darkness, had fired and fled, had become the ghosts they were ordered to be. The resentment towards the woman who had led them here had been burned away in the cold fire of shared suffering. They did not look at her with admiration. They looked at her because she was the fixed point in their spinning world, the North Star in a starless hell. She was no longer Sokolova. She was the captain. Vera stood before the final firing data, her own hands trembling, not with fear, but with a fatigue so total it threatened to unravel her mind. She looked at the coordinates for the last time. Then she looked up, across the ruined farmyard, at her battery. At Kruglov, nodding grimly from his launcher. At Markov, now awake and lashed to his post, his eyes meeting hers. At Grandfather, a hand resting on the fender of the cripple, as if calming a weary horse. She gave the order. This final salvo was their voice, a roaring, screaming, vengeful choir of fire that tore the graying sky apart. It was the sum of all their pain, their fear, their icy immersion, their bone-deep exhaustion, transformed into pure, obliterating force and hurled at the enemy. As the last rocket screamed away, the men did not wait for the command. They knew. This was the end of the dance. They collapsed where they stood, some sliding down beside the hot launch rails, others sinking into the mud. The silence after this roar was not terrifying. It was final, empty. The illusion was complete. 3 strikes, from 3 points of the compass, in one endless night. The ghost battery had sung its song of terror. Vera leaned against the cold stone of the farmhouse's lone remaining wall. The dance was over. But as the true dawn began to bleed light into the sky, she knew the price was yet to be fully counted. They had become ghosts. But the dawn had a way of making ghosts visible. The silence after the final salvo was a physical weight, a thick, cottony void pressing into the ears and the soul. It was the silence of a creature that has screamed itself raw and now has nothing left, not even breath. The men of the battery lay where they had fallen, in the mud and ashes of the ruined farm, their bodies spent husks. Some slept with the dead, instant slumber of the utterly broken. Others simply stared at the graying sky, their eyes reflecting the nothingness they felt inside. Vera leaned against the cold stone, the rough texture the only real sensation cutting through the numbness. Her mind, for the first time in 24 hours, was not calculating, not plotting, not anticipating. It was a blank, scorched field. The dance was done. The ghosts had played their part. Now there was only the wait for the reaction, the slow, painful process of reassembling themselves into something that could move, could escape. The reaction came not from the distant German lines, but from the sky. It began as a faint, high-pitched drone, a mosquito whine that was entirely wrong for the dawn. Vera's head snapped up, her body flooding with a cold, sickening adrenaline that was almost welcome in its familiarity. It was not a reconnaissance plane. The pitch was different, angrier. It was the sound of vengeance. From behind a low ridge to the west, a shape materialized against the brightening sky. Then another. 2 German Henschel Hs-129 ground attack aircraft, flying low and fast, their twin engines snarling. They had not been hunting randomly. They had triangulated. The final salvo, the grand finale of the ghost dance, had been a beacon. They had followed the last echoes of thunder home. The farmyard exploded into chaos. The drone became a scream. The lead aircraft banked, its silhouette growing monstrously large. The muzzle of its massive 30mm autocannon flashed, a rapid, winking eye of malevolence. The world disintegrated into noise and geysers of earth. The first burst walked across the yard, stitching a line of explosions that ripped through the debris, tore apart a wooden cart, and found Launcher 3. The rockets, still on their rails, detonated in a sympathetic, catastrophic chain reaction. A sun bloomed in the farmyard. A shockwave of heat, force, and shredded metal flattened men and machinery alike. The screams that followed were short, wet, and then silenced. Vera was thrown from her feet, her back slamming against the stone wall. The breath knocked from her lungs. Her ears filled with a high-pitched whine and the distant, underwater sounds of more screams, of roaring engines, of another strafing run beginning. She pushed herself up, her vision swimming. The farmyard was a scene from a madman's painting. Launcher 3 was a burning skeleton. Men lay twisted and still. Others crawled, bleeding, through the mud. Through the smoke, she saw Kruglov. He was not hiding. He was running, not away, but towards the cripple, the patched launcher that was now the closest to the inferno of its sister. His face was a mask of pure, frantic determination. He was not trying to save the machine. He was trying to save the men still near it, to move it, to prevent another cataclysmic cook-off. The second Henschel screamed in for its pass, its guns centered on the mass of vehicles. "Move! Get clear!" Vera's voice was a raw, torn thing, lost in the din. She saw it happen in terrible crystal clarity. Kruglov reached the cripple, shoving a dazed loader away from the truck's fuel tank. He looked up, saw the attacking plane lining up its run. There was no fear in his eyes, only a final, furious calculation. He lunged for the driver's cabin, to wrench the truck forward even a few meters, out of the kill zone. The autocannon fired. The heavy rounds hit the ground first, then walked up the engine block of the cripple. Metal screamed, glass exploded. One round, or a piece of shrapnel, took Kruglov in the side as he hauled himself onto the running board. The impact was brutal, lifting him, spinning him. He fell backwards into the mud, a dark, spreading stain instantly blooming across his side, turning the fabric of his tunic into a wet, crimson rag. The plane passed, its engines fading momentarily, banking for another run. In the relative lull, a new sound emerged. The crackle of flames from Launcher 3, the moans of the wounded, and a low, wet, choking sound from Kruglov. Vera was moving before she knew it. She sprinted across the open, smoking ground, ignoring the whistle of potential return fire. She slid to her knees in the mud beside the massive sergeant. His face was the color of chalk, his lips already tinged with blue. His powerful hands were clamped over the ruin of his side, but the blood welled up between his fingers, relentless and dark. His eyes, wide with shock and pain, found hers. The resentment, the defiance, the grief, all of it was gone, washed away by the simple, overwhelming fact of his mortality. He tried to speak, to form words, but only a burble of blood came out. Vera's mind, the cold calculator, was offline. The commander was gone. For a split second, it was just a woman looking at a dying man who had hated her, followed her, and was now bleeding out because of her orders. The weight of it was a physical blow. But the Henschels were circling back. The engine's snarl deepened. There was no time for horror, for guilt. She tore her gaze from Kruglov's face. She saw the situation with a brutal survivalist clarity. Launcher 3 was lost. The cripple was a wreck, its crew dead or scattered. But Launchers 1 and 4 were intact, their crews staring at her, paralyzed, waiting for a command that would either save them or condemn them. She stood up, her figure a stark, mud-spattered silhouette against the burning wreckage. Her voice, when it came, did not sound human. It was a drill press shriek of absolute authority that cut through the panic. "Launcher 1, Launcher 4, Immediate displacement. Driver, start your engines. Hook and go. Now. She did not wait to see if they obeyed. She turned to two men cowering near a ruined wall. You! With me! She pointed at Kruglov. Together they grabbed the big man under his shoulders, his blood soaking into their uniforms, and dragged him towards the relative cover of the stone farmhouse basement, a black hole in the ground. He was a dead weight, leaving a slick, terrible trail in the mud. As they half dropped, half lowered him into the darkness, the Henschels returned. Cannon fire and small bombs tore the yard apart again, searching for the remaining launchers. But the launchers were moving. The two surviving trucks, with men clinging to them like ragged barnacles, were lurching out of the farmyard, following the pre-planned escape route, driven by a terror stronger than exhaustion. Vera crouched in the dank, earth-smelling darkness beside Kruglov. The air above was a storm of noise and destruction. She fumbled for a field dressing, pressing the thick pad against the gaping wound. His blood was hot, shockingly so, against her cold hands. He was still conscious, his eyes locked on hers in the gloom. His hand, weak and trembling, came up and grasped her wrist, not to push her away, but to anchor himself. His lips moved. This time, she heard the words, a whispered, agonized breath that held the entirety of their journey, the mud, the disdain, the night of ghosts, and the final, terrible cost. Comrade, Captain. It was not forgiveness. It was recognition, an acknowledgement, paid for in blood, of the authority he had resisted. It was the final, brutal transfer of the battery's soul. Then his eyes lost focus, staring past her, into the dark. His grip went slack. Above them, the sound of the aircraft began to fade, their vengeance spent or their fuel low. In the sudden ringing quiet of the basement, Vera remained kneeling in the pooling blood, her hands stained red, the warmth leaching away into the cold earth. The ghost dance was over. The bill had been presented, and it was written in fire, metal, and the life of the man who had been her anchor to the old world. She was alone now, truly and completely, the commander of the dead and the survivors, the architect of a ruin that was no longer just on a map. The dawn that finally broke was a thief. It did not bring warmth or hope. It stole the protective cloak of darkness and illuminated the full, grotesque price of the night. The farmyard, now silent, but for the crackle of dying flames and the low moans of the wounded, lay exposed under a cold, gray-white sky. The air stank of burned paint, scorched metal, spilled fuel, and the coppery, intimate scent of blood. Vera emerged from the cellar, a figure carved from soot and drying blood. The crimson on her hands had turned to a dark, rust-brown crust. She stood for a long moment, her eyes sweeping the tableau of ruin. Launcher 3 was a blackened, skeletal monument, its tubes twisted into agonized shapes. The cripple was a gutted wreck, its patched axle finally and terminally broken, its cabin a shredded shell where Kruglov had made his last stand. Scattered around them were the darker shapes that were not debris. The living were gathering themselves from the edges of the carnage. They moved slowly, stiffly, like men emerging from a bomb blast. Their faces were blank with shock, etched with a fatigue so profound it had become a permanent feature. They saw her, and their eyes, hollow and old, held no accusation. Only a numb, waiting emptiness. She did not address them as a group. She began to walk. Her first steps were to the wounded. A young loader with a shrapnel-torn leg. A driver clutching a bleeding arm. She moved with a mechanical, efficient tenderness, kneeling in the mud beside each man, using her own belt, strips of torn uniform, whatever was at hand, to fashion crude tourniquets and pressure dressings. She spoke no words of comfort. Her touch was clinical, precise, but her presence was an anchor. She was there. The captain was there. The center had held, even if the world had exploded around it. Next, she walked to the dead. She did not flinch. She looked at each face, memorizing the features already settling into a strange, waxen peace. She closed the staring eyes of the signals operator from Launcher 3 with her bloody fingers. She arranged the body of a gunner she knew only as Sasha into a semblance of rest, crossing his arms over his chest. It was a commander's duty, a debt paid in silent, brutal ceremony. The surviving trucks, Launchers 1 and 4, had pulled back into the cover of a nearby copse of trees. Their crews stood by them, not as victorious soldiers, but as shell-shocked survivors. As she approached, they straightened, not to attention, but out of a raw, instinctive respect. She walked down the line of the 2 remaining girls, her girls now. She placed a hand on a fender, cold and scarred from the night's run. She ran her fingers over a rocket rail, still warm from the last salvo. The gesture was not affectionate. It was an assessment, a confirmation of what remained of her command. Finally, she walked to the medical cart that had arrived from the rear, a rattling wagon drawn by a gaunt horse. The living wounded were being loaded. At the back, on a stretcher slick with his own blood, lay Kruglov. He was alive, but barely. His breathing was a shallow, wet rasp. His face was the color of dirty paper, but his eyes were open, seeing. Vera stood over him. The giant who had been her antagonist, her obstacle, her reluctant right hand. The man who had bled out the last of his strength, trying to save men from a machine she had driven beyond its limits. He looked up at her, through a haze of pain and morphine. He tried to speak, but no sound came. Instead, with a monumental effort that cost him dearly, he brought his hand up from the stretcher. It was not a wave, not a gesture of dismissal. It was a slow, trembling movement that ended with his thick fingers touching the grimy brim of his non-existent hat, in a ghost of a salute. His eyes, holding hers, held the entire unspoken truth. The mission, the cost, the acceptance. It was the passing of the torch, drenched in blood and mud. Then the orderlies lifted the stretcher, loaded it onto the cart. The horse snorted, and the cart lurched away, carrying the last fragment of her past into the fog. Vera turned from the sight. She walked back to the center of what was left of her battery. The men, perhaps 20 of them now, out of the 40, had gathered in a loose, silent semicircle. They watched her. Markov, his face smudged with soot and tears. Grandfather leaning against a truck tire as if holding it up. The drivers, the loaders, the survivors. She did not give a speech. There were no words grand enough, no lies comforting enough for this moment. She simply looked at them, her gaze traveling from face to exhausted face, acknowledging each one. She saw their loss, their trauma, their utter depletion. And they saw in her eyes the same things, reflected back, but overlaid with the unbreakable steel of the responsibility she now carried for them. A staff car appeared on the ruined track, kicking up mud. A different officer emerged, crisp and efficient. He conveyed new orders. The battery was to withdraw fully for regrouping, refitting, and receiving replacements. They were to merge with another battered unit. The dance of the ghost battery was officially over. Its legend would be written by staff clerks. The officer finished, waited for her acknowledgement. Vera gave a single curt nod. He left. The men began the slow, painful process of preparing the 2 remaining launchers for the move. But Private Markov did not move. He stood, looking from the departing staff car to Vera, his young face a battlefield of confusion and loyalty. He took a step forward, his voice cracking from disuse and smoke. "Captain, when we get to the new position, the new men, will we still be with you?" The question hung in the cold air. It was not about orders. It was about identity. Were they just interchangeable parts to be reassigned, or were they still her battery? Vera looked at him. She looked past him, at the 2 scarred launchers, at the graves they would leave behind, at the ghost of Kruglov's salute. She saw the long road of mud and blood that had led from the birch grove to this ruined farm. The map of their suffering was etched on her soul. Her face, which had been a mask of command, of grief, of icy resolve, softened at the edges. Not into a smile, but into an expression of profound, weary, unshakable certainty. The mathematician was gone. The girl who hid her trembling hands was gone. The officer performing a duty was gone. What remained was the captain. She did not answer Markov with words. She walked past him, towards the lead truck. She placed her hand on the driver's door, her blood-stained, mud-caked fingers leaving a faint mark on the handle. She looked back at them all, her crew, her men, her shattered, magnificent family. Her gaze was her answer. It said everything. "We go together." She pulled the door open and climbed into the cabin. Grandfather was already behind the wheel, his ancient eyes meeting hers for a moment, before facing the road ahead. The engines of the 2 remaining Katyushas coughed, sputtered, then roared to life, a tired, wounded, but stubborn sound. The column, shortened and battered, began to move. It drove slowly past the smoldering wreckage of their past, leaving the dead in the care of the cold earth. They did not look back. There was nothing for them there. As the trucks picked up speed, joining the flow of other retreating, advancing, endless streams of men and machines on the vast, wounded landscape, a distant, familiar sound began to rise from somewhere far ahead, beyond the horizon. It was the deep, throaty, tearing roar of another Katyusha battery, unleashing its fury on some other patch of contested earth. The war, immense and insatiable, rolled on without them, around them, through them. Inside the lead truck, Vera Sokolova stared straight ahead, at the road unfurling like a scar across the land. Her hands, resting on her knees, were perfectly still. The trembling was gone forever. In its place was the steady, heavy, and permanent weight of command. She was no longer just a captain of rocket artillery. She was the keeper of ghosts, the mother of a brotherhood forged in fire and mud, the living heart of a battery that had learned to scream, to vanish, and to endure. The road ahead was gray, long, and uncertain. But she was not on it alone.